November 17th, 2018 may ultimately be marked in the history books as the most significant day of the 21st century. This is the day the French people decided to take to the streets to protest their big government and statist politicians that have taxed them at some of the highest rates in the Western world and have thrown their interest entirely to the curb. The Yellow Vest protests perhaps can be viewed as the most symbolic uprising against big government in the modern day. Those yellow vests worn by the protesters are part of a government mandate that French citizens have high visibility gear in their cars at all times in case of a breakdown. What says big government nanny state more than that? November 17th marked the first day of the Yellow Vest protests. As reported, it initially began as a movement to oppose an incoming tax on fuel by the Macron government that aimed to disincentivize the use of fossil fuels in the name of climate change.
The Yellow Shirt protests, which started in November over a fuel tax, have grown to include more economic grievances.
The proposed increase of 25 cents per gallon in gas taxes and about 10 cents on diesel was enough to send the French raging into the streets. You can better understand the anger when realizing French drivers pay about $7.06 per gallon of gas, half of that being tax. Through the weeks of anger, protests largely morphed into a broader display of dissatisfaction, with demands ranging from the resignation of French President Macron, a constitutional cap on taxes at 25%, leaving the European Union Frexit style, and for the government to reject plans by the United Nations to ease the path for millions of migrants to enter Europe. After 3 weeks of taking to the streets, with thousands arrested and even some deaths, the French people set a precedent for the world as the pressure placed on the government was enough to have the politicians fold under their weight. French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe initially announced a 6-month moratorium on the planned tax hikes, setting the decision to make fuel more expensive take place in the new year, a clear effort to calm what was happening in the streets. But the Yellow Vests' trust in their government and those who occupy it is so low the bait was not taken. As key figure of the protest, Benjamin Cauchy put it, "The French are not sparrows and do not want crumbs the government is giving them. They want the bouquet. In other words, they want everything they are demanding." Shortly after postponing the tax for 6 months, and after Cauchy's foreshadowing words, Macron announced that the hike would be cancelled altogether. The cancellation failed in baking the bouquet, and the protests continued for a 4th week. The 4th chapter of the Yellow Vest uprising, which resulted in almost 2,000 arrests, over 260 people injured, and more national press coverage shedding light on the horrible relations between the government and the people, Macron took to a televised address to throw more crumbs at the public. On December 10th, Macron would admit that he was to blame for the, quote, justified anger the French people were displaying over their government and announced new economic measures to put in place in order to try to satisfy the dissatisfied working and middle class folk. Specifically, Macron announced a hike in minimum wage, scrapping overtime pay taxation, and a request that employers provide their employees an end-of-the-year bonus tax-free. It will remain to be seen if the newly created crumbs will stifle anger and prevent the people from hitting the streets once again for another face-off with the power structure. But one thing is for certain, the French showed that when the ballot box fails the people, and when global elites decide to move against national interests, there is another option to take, and this option works. Take to the streets with a principled vision of demands. Don't settle for crumbs, and make the politicians fold. This is what the Yellow Vest protests have shown the world, and this movement appears to be spreading like wildfire. Yellow Vest protests have also broken out in Belgium and the Netherlands, where police and protesters have clashed over a general dissatisfaction with government. Police in Brussels had to use force to prevent protesters from reaching the European Parliament and other EU headquarters, something you didn't hear much about in Western mainstream media. The movement is also resonating with the German working class, who have become dissatisfied over government policy decisions such as raising the retirement age to 67. With the globalist world order moving ahead with agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord and the UN Migrant Pact, all of which will manufacture the same policy that sent the people of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands into the street in revolt, It would be a total surprise if the precedent set by the Yellow Vest movement was not utilized by the people in the hundreds of nations moving forward with these types of agreements. Consider that recent polls show that nations are rejecting mass migration. More migration is exactly what the UN Migration Pact, signed by over 150 countries, will facilitate. It will bring in a more orderly fashion to the migration wave already hitting Europe. Some nationalistic politicians are warning that the pact will bring in a 1984 style of censorship that will punish anyone questioning mass migration.
And one basic element of this new agreement is the extension of the definition of hate speech. The agreement wants to criminalize migration speech. Criticism of migration will become a criminal offense. And media outlets, and that also concerns you, that give room to criticism of migration can be shut down.
Doesn't this type of control reflect what caused the anger in France? The current migrant crisis in Europe has morphed from a social justice effort to give refugees a safe haven into a more politically driven effort to replace the current aging populations of the Western world. This change in narrative shows that hands are at play behind the curtain to steer the migration from the destabilized, poor, culturally different third world into the new socialist world order the West is moving into. So, is this Yellow Vest movement bound to become a European-wide, or even a worldwide rejection of globalist big government policies that are suppressing the average working individual and setting the stage for a replacement population that will embrace wealth redistribution and follow the leaders leaving Western civilization behind? I think we will find out shortly.